the things that, today's more, I guess, esoteric / occult kind of researchers within the military are looking for?
Oh yes, definitely, I think so. One of the things I do in the Cosmic War is I explore in the Edfu Egyptian texts and in the Sumerian texts the motivations for that war. And one of the interesting things that comes out in those texts, Henrik, is that the motivation for the war is in part the possession of the technology to wage that war in the first place. The Sumerian texts in particular are full of references to what are called the Tablets of Destinies, and I know some of your listeners that are familiar with the works of Sitchin will recognize that term. These tablets, whatever they were, gave their possessors enormous, extraordinary power, and on each occasion of their theft, they're actually stolen, from what I can tell, either 2 or 3 different times in history. The first time by Tiamat, which occasions a war between her and her allies, and Marduk and his allies. And then there is a second theft by Anzu, or Zu, depending on which version of the text that you read. His name varies slightly. And that again leads to a war, and it's that second war, in fact, that is fought with Ninurta opposing him, that leads to this inventory of the stones, so to speak, that were part of this technology, whatever it was. So I examine the text very, very carefully in terms of what they might suggest in terms of modern physics that would be capable of doing the types of things that those texts describe. They describe manipulation of emotions. They describe manipulation of weather. They describe the destruction of entire celestial bodies, in other words, planets. So in other words, this is a very sophisticated, very powerful technology. And I have a whole chapter in the Cosmic War devoted to a kind of a speculative reconstruction of what I think might have been in play in terms of the physics involved in those things.
Wow.
So yes, your question is an excellent one, and I think definitely people with an interest in esotericism or in science or anything of that sort might be able to look at these texts and come up with a similar sort of speculative reconstruction of what that technology may have been.
I don't know if I understand things correctly about this tablets of destiny, but I think I picked up on this, that there is kind of an echo to what is known as the Spear of Destiny here, that those who actually had the Tables of Destiny were, considered to be invincible to some degree. Is that right?
Yes, that's quite so. That's quite so. One of the interesting things that some of these texts reveal is that when Anzu steals them again from Enlil, the Council of the Gods has a meeting in which they are trying to find somebody that will go to war against him and attempt to recover them. And it's rather humorous when you read this thing, because all the gods demur. I can't do it because I'm busy that day, or, I can't do it because I've got other things to tend to, business affairs, or my weapons aren't strong enough. So this goes on for some time before they finally convince Ninurta, by kind of a subterfuge, actually, to do this. And then, again, once Ninurta has possession of them, he inventories them, he destroys some of them so that they can't ever be used again. Some of them can't be destroyed, and this is a very interesting aspect of the story, because then he decides that he's going to hide them. So in other words, if we take these texts literally, as I think we must do, then somewhere in that part of the world, something still may exist of that technology, which kind of puts an interesting spin to recent political events.
Well, exactly. I mean, this is very interesting, because in one way we can look at it like this, that the U.S. now, in a way, or even potentially that the EU is joining up with the U.S. or whatever the kind of the coalition is here, but they are trying to prevent, Iran and even Syria to have access to, nuclear weapons. So
right.
There's kind of an echo there, and yet the next level on this is, of course, that this has nothing to do with it. That is just a sham, just a play, so to speak, and they're really trying to get into this region for a number of reasons. But one of those might be what you just mentioned here, that they're actually are again looking for something.
Well, it's interesting that you mention that, because here in the United States there's a very famous researcher into the Kennedy assassination by the name of Jim Marrs.
Oh, yes.
He was actually one of the people that consulted with Oliver Stone on his famous movie about the Kennedy assassination. And he and I were in contact a few months ago, shortly after I appeared on your show previously. And the whole reason for him consulting me was he wanted to run that theory by me. And just to kind of flesh it out a bit more, I think it's very peculiar that in the run-up to this fiasco in Iraq, the reports, I don't know what was said in the news in Europe, but over here, and particularly in the United States and Canada, I would imagine this to a certain similar extent in Great Britain, that the selling point, so to speak, for this military invasion was to prevent Saddam Hussein from acquiring weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah.
And then as events subsequently unfolded, it was discovered, well, he didn't have any, and if he did, he got rid of them before we got there.
Yeah.
But, I've long suspected that maybe they were really talking about weapons of mass destruction of a very different and much more ancient sort. And once we say that, then we begin to look at that Baghdad museum looting again with new eyes of suspicion, because it certainly appears that somebody was looking for something. And it doesn't appear that they were just concerned with acquiring some old Sumerian and Assyrian clay tablets. They are definitely looking for something.
That's right. Again, weapons of extraordinary power and sophistication. And in your Giza Death Star trilogy, you elaborate on this idea that the Giza complex was a kind of a super weapon, basically, I guess,
Right.
And in your new book here, do you elaborate, have you found new evidence that there potentially was more of these structures around? You mentioned that potentially this could even stretch to other planets, the Moon, the Mars, Saturn. Is there evidence for this in some way?
Well, yes, there is, and I'm glad you asked that, because I kind of want to let your listeners know what I'm doing in this book as opposed to what I do in the Giza Death Star series. In the Giza Death Star series, I'm primarily concerned with looking at a kind of a speculative physics reconstruction of the idea that these texts themselves suggest, namely that acres or ziggurats or pyramids are always associated with this technology of mass destruction. And in this book, I'm more concerned with fleshing out the scenario of the war itself. But in doing so, one of the things I discovered about these tablets of destinies is that they seem somehow, always in the text, to be associated with these acres or pyramids or mountains, as they're sometimes called. Mm. And this is a rather interesting thing to me, because it seems to kind of indicate that whatever these tablets of destinies were, and I have I think a fairly good idea of what they might have been, they were, to kind of coin an analogy, the software that made the hardware work. Hmm. So in other words, if we kind of couple it together with what I said in the Giza Death Star series, the Great Pyramid shows definite signs that there were things inside of it that are now missing, that were at some point in the distant past removed.
Yeah.
I refer specifically to those very strange slots that exist in the Grand Gallery, and to the niche in the Queen's Chamber and so on, that looks as if they were receptacles for something.
Yeah.
We don't know what. And of course, Chris Dunn has hypothesized, and I think plausibly so, that they were some sort of resonator assemblies, at least in the Grand Gallery. So I think if we couple that with this whole idea of the tablets of destinies and then the inventory of the stones of power and so on that are talked about in the exploits of Ninurta, that we see definite signs that these two technologies were coupled together in some fashion, and that, again, the texts seem to support the idea that something was removed at least from the Great Pyramid, if not from other pyramids or structures in the region. So, yes, the answer to your question is I go into this in much more detail in the new book, and come up with some rather interesting conclusions as to what those tablets of destinies may have been.
Interesting, very interesting. So let's talk a little bit about potentially who, could have been fighting this war, and even maybe who the opposite sides here were, because you mentioned potentially here that humans were around at this point, either that they witnessed what was going on and actually wrote it down, or they were part of it. And I mean, when you're reading the texts, do you find that there is mention of, you mentioned giants, of course, so this implies that these could be from E.T., extraterrestrial, of course. But do you have any more idea beyond that this is, it's the Greys against the reptilians? I mean, does it ever become clear like that,
Well, what pops out in the texts, particularly the Sumerian texts, is you have a clear, and I reproduced some of these genealogical tables in one of the later chapters of the book. You have a very clear division, it would appear, in the Sumerian pantheon. On the one side, the so-called good side, you would have people like Marduk, Enlil, to some extent Ninurta, Enki, and some of these gods and so on, that are opposing in what looks to be a very protracted war, or at least a war that kind of erupts and then dies down and then re-erupts again. On the other side, you would have Tiamat, Kingu, Nergal, a very notorious character, incidentally the Babylonian god of Mars, and we'll get back to that in a moment. Anzu, and some of these others. And if you look at that in terms of the genealogical table, so to speak, of the Sumerian gods, it's two halves of essentially the same house. My analogy is to think of it in terms of World War I, where, you have the Hohenzollerns are related to the Saxe-Coburgs, or the Windsors in Britain are related to the Habsburgs, or related to the Romanovs, and so on and so forth. So you have kind of that similar situation occurring where the houses of the pantheon, like the houses of Europe, are all fighting each other. And this emerges very clearly. But the other thing that emerges, and let's go back to Nergal, the other thing that emerges is you can kind of trace this civilization to various combatants if you equate these people to their celestial bodies. Because Tiamat, of course, is very similar to the Hebrew word Tehom, which means the ancient primeval waters. So in other words, in Sitchin's reading, in Van Flanderen's reading, in my reading, that would refer to Krypton, this exploded planet, a water-bearing large planet. And this would mean, then, that you would have that planet, Mars, which in Van Flanderen's theory may have been a satellite of that planet, which would account for its very eccentric orbit once it's released by the explosion of that planet. And it would account for the sudden hemispheric-wide scouring and flooding that appears to have occurred on Mars very suddenly at some point. You would have those two celestial bodies. You would have also, in addition, if you factor in the Greeks and the wars of the Titans with this,